This happened to me about 3 years ago. It was brought up recently with my friends, and they suggested that I share it with everyone else. I've gone through therapy for this and trained in firearms as well. It was the creepiest night of my life. I spent it in what felt like a horror movie, and the memory is still so vivid. It was a Wednesday night in the middle of the summer. I was off work and my husband happened to be out of town at the moment. Our son was staying at his grandma's for the night. That meant I was home alone with my dogs, an 80-pound Aussie mix and my 80-pound German Shepherd/Pit Bull mix. I've always had some issues when sleeping home alone, so I tended to binge watch TV in the living room until I just couldn't keep my eyes open anymore. This particular night, I remembered that the trash pickup was coming the next day. I decided to turn on Game of Thrones for a bit and take the trash out a bit later. All of a sudden though, I realized it was now 1:30 a.m. and I still hadn't got around to doing my chores yet. My house has these two solid iron gates, one in the front and one to the side door/backyard. Lighting on our street or anywhere in our neighborhood isn't really that great. It's a very quiet place with a lot of families. You very rarely hear about any sort of crime here anyway. I looked out the window by habit before I went to take out the trash and saw a person I thought was my neighbor smoking a cigarette outside his gate across the street, looking directly into my window. For context, this is a fairly normal occurrence actually. The neighbor from across the street is trying to hide the smoking from his wife, so he'll typically do it late at night in front of the gate while looking out and thinking. I get off work pretty late, so I usually see him and we wave to each other and say hi, chat a little bit, go inside. He makes the joke, "You didn't see the smoking if my wife asks." And because of this, I was pretty unbothered by seeing the guy. I went outside, put out all my trash, opened my squeaky iron gate, and took it out to the curb. I didn't have my glasses on at the moment, so as usual, I waved to the person and said hello. Instead of waving back and joking with me though, the person I thought was my neighbor threw down their cigarette and quickly walked off around the corner. It took me a minute to register that this person was not my neighbor. I was a little bit creeped out, of course. That person had clearly been staring into my window from the opposite sidewalk. I tried to calm myself down. Maybe it was just a guy taking a night walk and stopping for a cigarette break or something. I thought I'd maybe weirded him out just as much as he'd done to me. I went back inside and laid down on the couch with my dogs to keep on watching Game of Thrones. At some point, I had nearly fallen asleep when I suddenly woke up to hearing my gate squeaking and my German Shepherd mix growling. He's extremely protective of our family at home, but he's also the kind of dog you can take pretty much everywhere because he's so friendly. My Aussie mix is more passive, but his sheer size and scary bark tends to deter people. He's very friendly as well. I quickly got up and pulled back my curtain. The gate was shut now, and I couldn't see anything outside. My dog, however, continued to growl and snarl. I looked out another window, which had a better view of my front yard and porch. I still couldn't see anything. Eventually, my dog did settle back down a bit, but I was still very uneasy. I ended up watching TV again because I just couldn't fall back asleep. About an hour later exactly, I definitely knew I'd heard my gate squeaking once more. Because the gates were heavy iron, it made a distinct noise. I looked out the curtain once again, my head snapping too, while my dogs were continuing to growl. To my surprise, my gate was now halfway open, but I couldn't see anyone outside. I started to panic. I couldn't find my phone. I grabbed my wooden baseball bat out of our room and crouched down. I started going through the couch cushions to find where my phone was. The dogs were now oddly quiet, staring out into the yard. I had no idea what could be out there. The minute I found my phone, my door handle started to shake. I ran to the side door and let my German Shepherd mix out. I knew he'd protect me, and he could jump the 6-foot back gate if needed. My Aussie mix, going crazy, burst out of our door side lights. Immediately as they ventured outside, I heard a guy scream out, "Oh shit!" I jumped to look out the window and saw my dog latching on to the man's hand. The guy started screaming and took off down the street with my dog chasing behind him. I became terrified he'd hurt my dog in revenge. I ran out with my baseball bat as well, screaming my dog's name over and over. Next thing I know, he was prancing down the street back to me, happy as shit with blood all over his face. I called the police and they took an hour or so to show up. Didn't seem to take me too seriously. They said they'd call the local hospitals, but I never heard anything back. I called my husband and he got the next flight home. I stayed at his mom's for a few days, too terrified to go back home. I bought both my dogs giant ribeyes for being so good and saving me. I don't know what that guy wanted, but since then I've been very vigilant at night. One time, I was walking home from the train station after I'd spent the weekend at my aunt's house. It was around 11 p.m. at night and already very dark outside. I was almost home when I noticed a man on crutches in front of me. He had been walking the same direction, but stopped every couple of meters to turn around and look at me before continuing to walk on. Since he was walking with a limp already, I very quickly passed him by. As I did, he stopped walking altogether and grinned at me in a strange way. I kept on moving on. Since I lived in an apartment over a burger restaurant, for a moment I considered asking one of the employees to walk me to the front door. To get to the entrance of the apartment part of the house, you had to walk around into a dark court area. I didn't ask in the end though. I thought, what could possibly happen? The guy is on crutches. I didn't want to come across as childish. There I was, walking through this dark court of our house. I wanted to pull out my keys while still walking. Suddenly, I couldn't find them in my handbag. I realized I had thrown them somewhere in my travel bag because I didn't want to lose them while staying at my aunt's and being out with her all the time. There I was, stuck standing in the middle of this dark area, having to search my whole travel bag for this damn key. I was so distracted, I'd completely forgotten about the creepy guy I'd encountered before. When I finally managed to pull the key out of the bag, I looked up, only to see that man standing right in front of me, grinning. I'd always thought about what I'd do in a situation like that. Maybe I'd start screaming or something. Instead, I couldn't get myself to make a sound at all. With the keys in my hand, I sprinted to the front door. I opened it and jumped inside my house. The man, although he did wear crutches and had a limp, was following me as fast as he could. Luckily, due to his injury, he wasn't as fast as me, obviously. Unfortunately for me, though, our door was one of those doors that slowly fall into the lock automatically. When you try to push them in order to shut them quicker, it pressures back to stop you from slamming it. There I was, trying to push the door into the lock, while the creepy guy was moving as quickly as possible to follow me into the house. Believe it or not, the door fell into the lock the exact second he reached the doorstep. Through the glass door, we just looked at each other, both breathing heavily from the race. He looked very disappointed and upset. I quickly ran upstairs to my apartment and locked myself inside. A while later, I looked outside my window, only to see the same man was still there walking up and down the road in front of my house. He'd been there for 3 or 4 hours after the initial incident. I didn't know what to do. I thought about calling the cops, but I thought nothing had happened really, and what could they do about this guy? After that, I didn't feel safe in my home anymore. I knew that the guy now knew where I lived. I only left my apartment when being picked up or dropped off, and made sure to be home before it turned dark every day for about 2 weeks. Finally, I decided to go to the police and tell them about it, to ask whether they could keep a special eye on the neighborhood for a bit. As I went down, it happened exactly as I'd feared. They took notes and said, "We can't really do anything about it now, you should have called before. We'll make note though, I guess." A couple of days passed by, and to my surprise, I actually got a call back from another officer. He asked me a lot about what had happened. He told me they'd actually been looking for this guy on crutches for months already because he'd molested several girls in our town. He'd followed them into their apartments, even slept out in front of their doors. He'd been in police custody before, got out and violated probation. He had some sort of mental illness too, I believe. The officer told me to immediately call this time in case the guy showed up again. Luckily, he never did. It was only then that I understood the seriousness of the situation and realized I'd most likely escaped an attempted assault in some sort of way by just an inch. In a way, I really couldn't make myself believe the whole thing had actually happened, at least before the police called me back. And that was 5 years ago, but I still think about it from time to time, and it still gives me the creeps. Hello, I have a more or less unusual story I would like to tell you, with a very clear memory of it. It takes place last year in 2021, on the day October 26th. I was often driving back and forth from Montreal to Quebec City for my work and to see my family at the time. It was late because I was driving at night, around 7 p.m. or so. I wasn't on the highway but on a national road, not very busy and surrounded by forests and plains. I didn't mind driving this area at night because I had good vision and very little fatigue. Halfway to my goal though, in the distance in the middle of the road, I realized I could see someone crouched down, and they seemed to be quite afraid. I was close to a town, so seeing a person out at night didn't seem that strange. Obviously, I couldn't just run them over, so I stopped on the side of the road. I realized now that it was a woman about my age who was crying and sobbing. I walked over to her and asked her if she was all right, if she was feeling well. After a few minutes of silence, she ended up telling me in a feverish tone that she was being followed and she was very afraid. I didn't know what to do. The stress was building up. This had never happened to me on this road before. I mean, how could it? I stayed close to her. I could hear in the distance footsteps coming behind us, coming up the side of the road. At first, it was just a vague and distant shadow from my point of view, but then I began to see the silhouette of a tall, thin man. My brain very quickly understood that this must be the person that girl was afraid of. She was paralyzed and still crouching, like she couldn't move at all. I grabbed her up in my arms and shoved her into my car to take her to the nearest police station, so at least she would be safe and have a roof over her head for the night. I started the engine and continued to drive normally. I glanced back in my central rear view mirror as I drove away. I could see the man more precisely now that he was closer. He was standing there not moving, dressed in a really wild way. To my amazement, he got down on all fours like an animal would and started to chase after the car until the distance cut me off from his view. After this story, which was quite frightening in the moment, I took the young woman back to a Quebec station and explained the situation. After a few days, I was able to get some more information. That woman, who, if I may give a bit of a slight tangent, is my partner to this day. Fortunately, I happened to take the road that night, had broken down in the middle of the road. A man had come to talk to her and offer her help and invite her to his house. She refused at first, finding the man very strange. The man was not satisfied. He grabbed her hand and tried to attack her. She started to struggle and run. I found her after she'd run ahead, and she was having a panic attack in that moment. The man continued to follow her down the road until I saved her, as she says today. And that's pretty much the story. In retrospect, I don't really know what this man was expecting to do. Maybe he was used to taking women to his house. Fortunately, my partner didn't have to go there a year ago. I'm pretty sure he was going to hurt her. This happened 7 years ago, but I still remember the fear like I felt it yesterday. When I was in my early 20s, I worked the night shift at a bakery, making the donuts. I loved that job. 3 nights of the week I would be with my coworker, and 2 nights I would be working alone. It was summertime, and we were having some problems with the AC. The maintenance guy, Andy, came at night when I was on the clock to work on it. The bakery was small and crowded during the day, so it was best for him to come when it was empty. Management always let me know when Andy would be there, so it was never really a surprise. At first, he was very pleasant actually. I had no issues sharing the space with him as we worked. One evening, though, that all changed. My coworker happened to be a little bit late this time. She told me later she'd lost track of time in the shower. Andy piped in, saying we should all shower together to save time, and started laughing. I found that quite creepy. I stated I lived alone, and he responded, "Good, I have you all to myself then." After that night, I realized Andy wasn't the kind guy I initially thought he was. I stopped speaking to him unless I had to, and before long, the AC had been repaired and I thought I was finally free of him. Fast forward to a night a few weeks later though. I was working all alone and it was 2 a.m. I was frying donuts when I heard a loud banging on the front window. Startled, I look up and see who else but Andy. He was calling my name and crouching below the window, asking to be let in. No one had said anything to me about him coming that night. Andy started to tug on the front door handles. Luckily, it was locked. I ran to a corner of the bakery where he couldn't see me and tried calling my manager with no response. The phone started ringing. I could see the caller ID from where I was sitting. It was Andy. He was being relentless and wouldn't stop banging on the windows and trying to get in. My fear was rising, and I dialed 911. The cops arrived within 10 minutes and searched Andy's vehicle. In the back seat, they found duct tape, a knife, and some rope. They told me they couldn't do anything though because he hadn't harmed me. Andy told the police he was just there to fix the AC, and they believed him. My manager called me back in the morning and told me the AC was working perfectly fine. They'd never asked Andy to come. Whatever he had planned for me, I'm glad I didn't have to find out that night. Last year, I was staying in a university hall for my final year. It's a private building, so not connected to the university, and out in the city near the main town. We have a car park, but nobody really uses it because we're poor students and it costs money to park there. Mine was one of the only 2 or 3 cars at any given time. It wasn't very well lit, and it was to the side of the building as well, so you had to walk for about 2 to 3 minutes to get to the main door. I was sitting in my car one evening after just getting back from the gym, just scrolling on my phone because my seat was warm. It was dark and raining outside, so I couldn't really be bothered to go out yet. I was reading an article when suddenly someone began to knock on my window. Obviously very odd. It was a man dressed completely in black. He started telling me how his friend had seen me through the window and thought I was really attractive, so could he have my number? I responded no. That was really weird and I didn't feel comfortable with it. He continued to stand at my window for a while, practically begging me to get out and give him my number, or at least my social media details. He told me I should come over and speak to his friend. You would have expected him to be talking about himself and making things up, right? But weirdly enough, I could see his friend stood at the other side of the car park, furthest away from the building, hiding in darkness. I obviously said no. I scrolled on my phone to show that I wasn't interested. Finally, he relented and walked away. I texted one of my friends to ask if he'd come and get me and walk with me to the building. As I was waiting, the man returned with his hood up and started to bang loudly on my window. He said I was being rude, ungrateful, and started calling me all sorts of names. I kept staring at my phone and pretended I couldn't hear him. He started trying my door handle. Thankfully, I'd locked my car after the first encounter. He then began to slam violently on my windows. I still kept ignoring him and texted my friend to bring some other friends with him now as well. My friend was taking a long time to read my message. I was terrified, but for some reason I didn't think to call the police. I guess I was scared of things escalating. The guy at my window calmed down after a few minutes and walked off, saying he'd leave me alone now. I watched though as out of the corner of my eye, I saw him join up with his friend and then 3 or 4 other men. They walked so they were just out of sight, but I could see their shadows lingering as they began to circle around my car. They moved closer, still staying in the dark. They lingered there for a while. Luckily, another car came, which was obviously full of students going to a party, mostly due to the loud music and singing going on inside. This group of men left as soon as they saw these people arrive. I latched onto the group and was able to walk with them as they entered the building. When I got home, my friend finally responded. He said he'd actually heard about these guys before. Apparently, they'd followed another girl into the building and into the lift a couple of days prior, then stood in there trying to lock her in. She had to run for her door and lock it behind her, where they then stood outside knocking and whispering for her to open it for like an hour. We were able to report this to the building, who, to their credit, then hired a permanent set of security staff. We also got the CCTV footage of both incidents and were able to pass this on to the police.